Okay, so we're here in lesson 15 begin, and we're going to take a little break from doing all of the combing and things like that and work a little bit with color. So color inside of XGen is, well, is equally confusing as everything else kind of tends to be in XGen because of how different of a system it is and most everything else in Maya. There's a lot of different things that actually play into how the fur gets colored. And to make things a little bit more confusing, we have the issue that fur is colored completely differently viewport wise, rather to see the preview, as it is to actually render the fur. So two different processes. Let's first take a look at how we can actually get a preview of some color in our viewport for our fur. So we need to go here to our preview and output tab. And actually, let's first do a preview just of the fur as is. So we'll just do a quick preview. We're only previewing at 20%. So you can see that it's, it looks like it has some white, some gray, but in reality it doesn't. It's actually just this weird kind of grayish, bluish, darkish color over here. The reason we're seeing all of this kind of shine to it right now is the actual hair shader, something we're going to look at a little bit later in the course, is reflecting quite a bit. So to make sure we actually see our true color here inside of the viewport, what I'm going to do is quickly adjust that shader. I'm just going to go to my Hypershade over here. Again, we'll talk more about this shader later. That's this XGen physical hair shader here. And I'm going to go down to reflection color, and I'm just going to shut off. And you'll see that now it's just this solid gray color. Okay, so let's see how we can put our own color in here. Now I've gone ahead already and created some color maps over here inside of Photoshop. You can see I have this tip color and this root color. These were painted inside of ZBrush just using the kind of spray paint type techniques. It's very simple, nothing complicated. And that's because it's just, to give the fur general coloration. I have little spots in here, so some fur pieces of fur, hairs, whatever you want to call them, will have slightly off colors to make it look a little more organic. Don't worry about stretched UVs. It was painted in 3D, so when they sit on the model, everything looks just fine. And again, I have one that's darker for the roots and one that's lighter for the tips. That I just did afterwards inside of Photoshop. Again, I did these in ZBrush. You can feel free to paint them in Photoshop, in Mudbox, in whatever you'd like. The Substance Painter is a new great one as well. And of course, things like Mari. So having those, I'm going to go ahead and do the same trick that I did with my mask earlier in order to get that in here. And that's because those are texture maps, and we know that this system uses PTEX maps. So here under Preview and Output, under the primitive color, I'm just going to come over here and create a map. I'm going to call this Display Color so I can differentiate it from the other colors later on. So Display Color, we'll maybe give this a resolution of 10 so it's a bit higher. And we'll just hit Create. You can see it goes into paint mode over here, just as it did before. So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly paint a little bit on the surface over here, just so that it has something to save. I'll go ahead and hit the little Save button here so it converts something to PTEX. And I'll exit the tool. So again, just as before, let's go into our Hypershade. We're going to go into our textures over here. And these haven't appeared yet. These take quite a while to appear in this version of mine. I'm not sure why. But this one over here is obviously the one to the right is the newer one. This is our old mask over here. And I'm going to go ahead and just load in one of my two maps. Let's just take the tip color map right here. Okay, there it goes. So I'll close this off, head back to XGen, and now let's go into paint mode. And just as before, you could see it's loaded in that texture file into the 3D paint. You'll notice it's not super detailed. It's actually a little washed out, and there's separate reasons for that we'll talk about later. But you can see the reason it's so kind of washed out, it's because the 3D painting system is a little bit limited in how much texture resolution it has. But it'll be good enough for preview purposes. So I'll just hit Save over here and exit. And now I'm going to go ahead and re-preview my fur. And you can see now I have that color. So at least I have a representation of what the fur is going to kind of sort of look like later on. It's not super accurate, but it's better than what we had before. Now, for rendering the fur, actually changing the color of the fur that renders in Metal Ray, we have a couple other things we have to do that are a bit different. let's start by taking a quick render and just seeing how this fur looks as is. And when you see the result, you might be a little surprised. He looks more like an orangutan. We have this really kind of brownish, goldish colored fur. Now, the reason for this is because, number one, as I mentioned, the color we've put in so far is only for viewport purposes. The actual color otherwise is produced right now by the shader. And if you recall, we saw that very, very briefly inside of the Hypershade here. Just going to jump over to that XGen shader, and you can see it's this color here. Now, we could set up the color through here, but that's actually going to limit us a little bit. What I'm going to do instead is actually set up my hair color through the XGen window here through custom shader parameters. That's going to allow me, rather than having one color, to have a root color and a tip color. Now, we're going to do that down here through custom shader parameters. So I'm going to start by setting this to color. And for the tip color, I'm going to type in tip underscore color, and I'll hit plus. Okay. Now, I'm not going to make the second one just yet, and that's because these 3D paint modes can be a little tedious when we have more than one of them at a time. Now, the reason I need a 3D paint mode is because I don't have these textures as PTEX maps yet. So what I need to do is actually convert this to either a PTEX. Right now you can see it's just a numerical value, either a PTEX it's input or a texture, 3D texture input. But I do that by clicking on the expression button here. I'm going to go here to Samples, Global, UI, and down over here I can choose, you can see PTEX or 3D Paint. Again, there is nothing for just regular textures. Really hope they add something in, because right now it's just a real pain to kind of go through this workaround. So I'm going to select 3D Paint over here, and you can see it's already giving me an error here that this doesn't exist, and that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and change the name of this though. We're going to call this 3D Paint Map, we'll just call it Tip for right now. I don't want it to accidentally overwrite anything else. So I'll hit Accept. Okay, and just as before, I'm going to go into my paint mode here, and let's paint something. You can see it's a little tough to see in there right now. Let's go ahead and bring up the 3D Paint tool. And there, we painted some white strokes on the surface. I'll go ahead and hit Save. And if you actually take a look over here in my window, it just created this paint map tip, and you can see it made a PTEX for me there. So that's why I want it separately. I didn't want it to interfere with these that I'm actually using. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and exit that out. And just as before, let's go into our Hypershade. Rendering Hypershade. We're going to jump into textures. Here's a new texture off to the right. I'm going to go ahead and load in my tip color. We'll hit Open. There we go. And now let's go ahead and load it up through XGen. I'm going to go back into Paint mode. You can see it's loaded it up for me. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Save. So that should be saving it to the disk for me now. Okay, so I now have that file as my tip color PTEX file. So what I'm going to do is now go ahead and remove this. And I'm going to do that just by coming over here. I'm going to go back to Samples, Global, UI, and this time I'm going to choose PTEX. I'm going to go ahead and hit Accept. It's not going to be able to find it. It's looking at color map 1. I'm going to direct it to where it actually is, which is here under my collections. I'm going to go to this new paint map tip, and we'll select that folder, and it should be able to find it in there. Okay, so we now have the color set up for the tip. For the root, we're going to go through almost the exact same process. We're going to go to Root, Color. We'll go ahead and create that. I'm going to go ahead and convert this Samples, Global, UI, and we'll select 3D Paint. Okay, and we're going to call this Paint Map Root. Accept. Go ahead and go into Paint mode, paint a few strokes on here. We'll go ahead and make sure that gets saved. We'll exit out of here. Rushing through this one just because we just did this like twice in a row. Coming into my Hypershade, and I'm going to go ahead and textures. Here's a new texture on the right. Let's load in our root color. There we go. We once again go back to XGen, Go back to paint mode. There's the darker texture. We go ahead and save that. Excellent. We exit, and now I want to convert this back to ptext. So I go back over here, samples, global, UI. There's our ptext map. We'll accept that. Remember, it's in the wrong location, so we're just going to browse to the correct location, which is the paint map root right there. And now let's go ahead and take a quick render and see what we have. And there we go. We can see our colors beginning to come through. It's not the, rather, it doesn't look amazing. It actually is a little bit lighter, a lot lighter than I need it to be. And we'll talk when we discuss shaders a little bit later, how we can darken the fur back up, get it closer to my original colors. You also, again, noticed it was lighter in the viewports as well. But for now, we actually have our color maps in. They're in place, so we're good to go for right now. We'll discuss lighting and shaders when we're done working on our dynamics and animation. So with that said, I think this is a good time to finish off this lesson. And in the next lesson, let's start talking about some of the different methods we have to add some animation to this fur when it moves. So I'll see you guys in the next lesson.